WellPod at DC on Riot Radio.
From meditation, stress management, safer substance use, and sexual health, we will literally talk sex, drugs, and rock and roll.
Join us to dive deep into some student health questions. We'll learn about wellness together, try some coping tools, and meet some interesting people.
Your co-hosts, Heather and Craig.
Perfect blend of Campus Health and Wellness Center and Sal's.
Each week, we'll DIY a wellness tool together.
And then nerd out and dig into the science behind how it works.
Email your health and wellness related questions to wellpod@durhamcollege.ca to be discussed anonymously on air. Welcome to the WellPod at DC.
Welcome to the WellPod at DC, live from the Media Hub here on riotradio.ca. In 2021, Billie Eilish sang, "I can't take it back once it's been set in motion. You know I need you for that oxytocin." So today, our student question of the week is, I've heard that oxytocin is the live hormone, but what does it actually do? Do I need it? What if I'm not in a relationship and I feel weird about self-pleasure? But I've heard it's actually good for you. Is that true? So today, we're going to be talking about oxytocin, touch, and self-pleasure. Yes, we're going to be talking about masturbation and oxytocin as the wingmate, how we can kind of biohack using some oxytocin tips and skills to maybe support our relationships, well-being, and learning. So that's our day today. Mm-hmm. So oxytocin has been called many different names. We've heard it as the social hormone, the love hormone, the tend and befriend hormone, the calm and connect hormone, and one of my favorites, the moral molecule. Molecule?
Molecule, yeah.
Thank you. I got it that time. So the term oxytocin may have been used in the 1800s, as earlier even as the 1500s, but in 1906, Sir Henry Haylett Dale, an English physiologist, is said to have coined the term that we now use as oxytocin, using extracts from oxen pituitary glands and adding a few drops to a pregnant cat's uterus, causing contractions. So once again, kind of animals being used in some experimental ways. It's Greek for quick birth. Oxytocin was known mainly for its childbirth functions. And I know, Craig, we kind of chit-chatted as we were researching for the show, and I said that's kind of years ago when I heard oxytocin, the world I kind of knew it in kind of birth and labor.
Yeah, and that's what I know it from mostly as well, though. That's interesting that that's the background of the name. I don't know if I've come across that or I've forgotten it, but it's interesting, but shows you how rooted it is in that area. And like we're saying, from what we've mostly learned about, at least I know that I've mostly learned about from that standpoint.
Yeah,
it's kind of
absolutely
awesome how much it does.
Yeah, so let's talk about some of the other things that it does. But first, oxytocin is a hormone made in the hypothalamus, stored and released into the bloodstream by the pituitary gland. So oxytocin has something called a positive feedback loop, which is really interesting. So when we release oxytocin, it stimulates the pituitary gland to even release even more. So more. It plays a key role in, yes, reproduction, but also attraction and bonding. So women get a burst of oxytocin during childbirth. This is what stimulates uterine contractions, and pitocin is synthetic oxytocin. It's often used to either induce labor or in the third stage of labor to help control bleeding. Oxytocin contracts our breasts as well for lactation, and in men it contracts the vas deferens to push sperm and semen forward for ejaculation. So basically oxytocin is kind of this like muscle contractor. We see it being used in our body to essentially help with contractions. We see another huge burst of oxytocin during female orgasm, but besides being just a contractor of muscles, it plays a big role in intimacy and bonding. So when we look at our menstrual cycle, we see elevations of oxytocin during ovulation. So this is to really help increase our attraction and our libido. So it's trying at the best time to enhance that chance of us getting pregnant. What's really interesting, though, is it plummets right in our lateral phase. This is when we do not feel like being social. Perhaps research is saying to almost protect the chances that happened earlier in the menstrual cycle with conception. So that way we're not perhaps mating with some others during this time to kind of protect that aspect. So during sex, we see waves of oxytocin in women. Research is looking at, does this help us form a sense of safety and sexual arousal and trust, thus supporting the chance of having an orgasm, and then thus, once again, increasing the chance of conception happening. So really interesting how all of these things are kind of at play here, basically for reproduction needs. Research has also demonstrated that oxytocin can decrease anxiety and protect against stress, particularly when in combination with really strong, healthy social supports. Oxytocin is also involved in the initiation of maternal behavior. So it really helps us bond to our offspring. What's really interesting, though, is it's not just the ones that we've given birth to. What research has identified is studies are finding it's higher, oxytocin is higher in mothers after they interact with unfamiliar children rather than their own, perhaps to ensure that we actually bond and take care of this, even though it's not our kin. A really cool area as well is oxytocin may help protect against the trauma of labor and delivery, helping manage both the emotional and psychological responses, kind of converting what could potentially be a stressful and traumatic experience into an opportunity for love and joy. And so mothers with higher levels of oxytocin are much more likely to engage in affectionate parenting behaviors, thus helping with the survival of the offspring. So it helps us get pregnant, give birth, and bond afterwards. Low levels of oxytocin have been associated with lower mood and feeling like your survival is at risk. Latest research is looking at how we might use it as an antidepressant and how it might inhibit the development of tolerance and withdrawal symptoms to various addictive drugs such as opioids and alcohol. Low oxytocin levels also have been linked to autism spectrum disorder. We're not quite sure what that link is, and there's a lot of mixed research results that are being conducted here, but it could be a potential treatment, especially in supporting intergroup dynamics. For instance, oxytocin may help decrease noise in the brain's auditory system to increase our perception of social cues, supporting more kind of targeted social behaviors. Oxytocin might also facilitate social information processing and social reward learning. It helps dull the threat of our kind of negative social responses, negative social information gathering, and foster more social recognition. It enhances what we call pro-social behavior, such as empathy and generosity. And Craig, I can't recall if you talked about this when we last talked about oxytocin, when we talked about trust, but when they've studied wild chimpanzees, after a chimpanzee has shared food with a non-kin related chimp, the levels of their oxytocin increase. So it really ties into this whole sharing is caring kind of mindset. Studies have also seen higher levels of oxytocin, helping to enable humans share more emotional details and stories with more emotional significance, reducing the fear of social betrayal. High levels of oxytocins have also been correlated with romantic attachment, but it can lead partners to become overly attached. And so a term that we sometimes see in pop culture is this idea of trauma bonding. So we've shared some really intense information, perhaps released a lot of that oxytocin, and that what might be happening is we're kind of too trusting and kind of overlooking unhealthy behavior. So as Beyonce once sang, we can get drunk in love. One final really interesting study is that oxytocin was being used as a nasal spray, and they looked at a group of monogamous relationships in men, and they gave them a nasal squirt of oxytocin. And in comparison to single men, what they were finding is it increased the distance in which monogamous men in relationships put between them and a new attractive individual. And so they went from being 10 centimeters away to 15 centimeters away. So researchers are wondering if this suggests that it may help promote fidelity with monogamous relationships relating to those studies. Research also is seeing oxytocin linked to producing and promoting more ethnocentric behavior, so incorporating the trust and empathy of in-group with suspicion and rejection of outsiders. the relationship here with trust is not fully known. Paul Zach's Trust, Morality, and Oxytocin TED Global Talk in 2011 try to explore the research here behind the morality molecule, but the effects here on social behaviors is very complicated. What we're seeing in research is oxytocin kind of fuels sometimes kind of more negative pro-social behaviors like envy and conformity. And studies on the African fish daffodil cichlid are highlighting this complexity. Craig, what are some evolutionary kind of biology perspectives, and what's going on with this fish?
Yeah, I think you touched upon a lot of it that's really interesting. And kind of to start off with, I think I was saying it earlier, but just the like what's in our culture and what we tend to hear about, right? That it's like some sort of pop culture things, and you mentioned some, but like, oh, it's the hug hormone or the cuddle chemical or the moral molecule, though I haven't heard that one as much as just like this love hormone, if you will, right? And so it's interesting because even that, I'll say I was a little biased towards humans specifically, and like a lot of the examples that you mentioned there, you find it throughout the animal kingdom, and even in terms of like invertebrates I came across where it's not the exact same chemical, but as some of the names that I'll mention show, like basically the same. I'm sure a little slightly different chemical structure, but like you find it even in things like insects. You have inotocin, fish, isotocin, and you just mentioned the cichlids there. Reptiles, mesotocin, and then like the apes, and I've come across rodents, dogs. You find oxytocin or oxytocin-like chemicals throughout these different species, which is fascinating from an evolutionary standpoint, because even if maybe it's not being used the exact same way in insects as in humans and apes, it's just kind of interesting to think like it's out there and what role does it play, and from an evolutionary standpoint. And some of the things that I came across that was interesting, thinking not just human interactions, but like with dogs, I mentioned, have oxytocin. So there's a lot of interesting research out there, though I'll say some of the stuff I came across said was some of the research might not be as good or harder to tease apart some things and so on. But it was interesting in terms of monitoring the release of oxytocin in both the human and the dog. You mentioned like moms taking care, or even women taking care of babies that aren't their own, and the release. It was the aspect of, finding increases in oxytocin when someone who it's maybe not their pet dog, but they find a dog and they have to take care of it for a time for somebody or until they find the owner, and there's an increase in oxytocin. I'm sure it's probably, I didn't read this, but depending on how scary the dog might be and so on. But there's a release, joking aside from the, I'm interacting with this dog. Okay, let's look around and trying to console and those kinds of things, right? And one interesting article was sort of comparing like dogs that you weren't the owner, but then owners and their own dogs and so on. And that actually found an increase in the release of oxytocin when the person was interacting with their own dog. And then even the dogs, depending on the type of interaction with the owner or a non-owner, how much oxytocin they're releasing. But all that to say, it comes down to that connection aspect, at least in some small part. And you mentioned, and we'll get into it later, but some of the interactions maybe with hormones that are being discovered, and how does all of this work, which was very fascinating. But in terms of beyond the even the dogs, like people interacting, as you already mentioned, right? But with babies and the release and how those again, I'm getting ahead of myself, but the interactions among the other hormones, not just the oxytocin, end up getting regulated is just fascinating when you get down to it, and we'll chat about it a little bit later. But as you mentioned, like something that stuck out to me, and I don't know, like, sort of what connections were interesting to you as you went, but, you come across, as you said, right, sexual arousal, building relationship, romantic attachments, promoting parent-infant bonding. But then I came across things like helping people recognize each other. And then it was like, that seemed odd to me. I don't know about you, but like, why would it be like I recognize you, like, what does oxytocin have to do with that, right? And so on. But just kind of makes sense. You have a partner that you have I'll say positive, connection with. Okay, well then oxytocin is released both in those interactions, but then in terms of affecting our memory. And you mentioned it somewhat briefly, but trust.
Yeah.
Right? And so it's not just love per se, but what about our friends and people within our circles, if you will, of how oxytocin interacts there. And there's a lot of research that says, yeah, there's a building of trust. This chemical is somehow, or hormone is somehow involved in recognizing people who you know and people that you trust. And so then is it, or it is being released in the sense of I'm around someone that I trust versus, okay, here's a new person. I haven't maybe, sussed them out yet. And so not as much oxytocin being released and so on, which is fascinating because then it gets to what we'll talk about again later, but like our memories. And I never really thought about that because again, it's the, love hormone or cuddle chemical or whatnot, but it's involved, as we'll see, in making memories of this person is somebody that I love or at least trust and whatnot, and recognizing things. But then what about for learning things, in a post-secondary or any sort of education scenario of, how does it interplay there for me working on my homework for math class or whatnot? And oxytocin is somehow involved. I thought it was the love chemical. So it's, just very interesting for that. But kind of coming back then to the interaction with the cichlids, it was some interesting research from the standpoint, I guess, of oversimplifying that, as we've said, the love hormone, but that the researchers would take, male cichlids and then provide them with the appropriate version of oxytocin, and then monitor what their reactions were. And then what they found was, if there's an individual, right, and then they're much more aggressive, right, which is weird relative to but this is a hormone that's supposed to be about love hormone, but now we're giving it to this male, and this male is becoming more aggressive. And what they did was, how they found that, I should say, is like, let's put one other male in there versus we put a number of males, I should say, into the aquarium along with them. And it was, if we put one in there, this male starts really displaying very aggressive responses. But if we put multiple males in there, the response is much more docile, but you've increased the amount of the same exact chemical. But what's going on here? And basically what they revealed through various means of doing this was, it seems like it's a chemical that in terms of the trust and social connection is almost tied to like figuring out how I belong here. So I'm a fish maybe that's given, the oxytocin equivalent, and one other male is put in there. Okay, it's involved in maybe showing my dominance over this other male. If you put a variety of males in there, maybe it's about, okay, which in all of these, amongst all of these individuals, where do I sit or fit, if you will? So it's really interesting in terms of, then overlapping, like, well, is it as simple as, love hormone between, two people, or is there sort of more complex, going on in terms of that? Excuse me. Still getting over.
Tis the season.
Tis the season, unfortunately, right? And so, as I mentioned before, it kind of then also overlaps with, this is not the one and only chemical, and this is where the research is hard, like I said, with the dogs too. It's not the only chemical in that fish in the end. How is it interacting with other hormones that it might be producing, and then changing those interactions amongst a one-on-one situation versus a group situation in the end, right? And so, it's just really interesting to think about. It's not just as simple as maybe we've like kind of thought about previously.
And on that note, I would imagine, because as we've been talking, all these kind of hormones are working together to get our body functioning. I would imagine it kind of has some buddies that it often likes to kind of tap into. I'm thinking maybe things like dopamine and serotonin. So what's the relationship with some of the other hormones that we have floating around?
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, as we were alluding to, it's not just a standalone. So I'll chat about some of those and research I've come across in terms of cortisol. We've talked about cortisol on the show before. That's that like long-term stress hormone, right?
Yeah.
And so something like, I always use the example of like exam week, right, is a couple weeks away or whatnot, and that release of cortisol, or family, friends, yourself going through some stressful like long-term events and whatnot. And so it was actually tied to some of that dog research as well. I came across articles of like, yeah, what were the changes when the individuals, what the human, the dog, were interacting with dogs they knew, humans they knew, or ones they didn't, and so on. And really broadly, it's cortisol is this, stress hormone. Oxytocin is to move away from maybe just love, but love, trust, bonding hormone. And so generally they tend to be the opposite to each other, where you're interacting with somebody that, you're bonded or at least trust, with, then cortisol tends to decrease. And you have, because of the increase in oxytocin versus vice versa, right? I'm in a stressful, like, I don't know anybody here or whatnot.
Yeah.
Maybe a bit oversimplified example, but then, okay, cortisol is increasing, oxytocin is decreasing, right? And so at least for me, what comes to mind is, and maybe it's not a long-term stress, but as people with kids, right? What do we tend to do? Like, kid falls over, gets a little bit injured, right? As much as, of course, I want to make it better, is swoop in, a hug, they're crying, right? But there's that connection in there. Not that it takes away everything, but is that oxytocin from the connection going to help to decrease the cortisol, right?
Very neat.
Yeah, so it was really interesting that opposite reaction. But then kind of, again, sorry to keep saying the same thing, but getting away from just the love, if you will, or bonding connection, is the aspect of going back to more the preparing for exams. And cortisol is, with that stress and the release of cortisol, there's some benefits there. But oxytocin in decreasing, research shows that oxytocin is tied to memory formation.
Ooh.
So it's a challenge in terms of when we're under very stressful events. Sometimes it's hard to then remember, how come I can't remember this material from class, or even a stressful event in terms of, maybe I was in a bad situation and now I have to talk to the police, and what did the individual look like? I don't, well, because there's those interactions between these hormones here. And so sometimes maybe the less extreme example, but how do I manage my cortisol levels with some help by oxytocin to decrease my stress so that I can form memories for studying for things or whatever the case happens to be, which was, a really interesting one as an educator that I've not come across before. Never had on my mind that oxytocin would be involved in that, right? But it does go back to the, as we said, connecting with people we know and feeling bonded. It's the, how do we recognize people that we know? And I'm vastly oversimplifying, not just oxytocin, but oxytocin is involved in that memory, right?
Yeah.
And so similar to my coursework to some extent, right? And I know we'll come back to that a little bit later, but then dopamine is connected to it as well. Dopamine being a sort of excited, attracted hormone were some of the words I came across. So probably oversimplification, but that if we think about it from a love hormone standpoint, oxytocin, dopamine is the more excitement, like, oh, I met someone who I find very attractive and am connected to. And then over time, sort of, if you will, transitioning to the oxytocin. But in this case, it's more the two adjust together, right? In terms of maybe initially dopamine and later oxytocin, but there's not a opposite interaction.
Yes.
Serotonin is a hormone involved in our mood and happiness and so on. And so very similar interaction to that. Less of a bonding, maybe I shouldn't say bonding, less of a, love hormone, but maybe think about it more like with hanging out with friends, right? Here I am relaxing. Good. I feel good. I feel safe in this area.
Yeah.
Yep. Serotonin's being released because I'm, having fun. Oxytocin as well from that social interaction. But ones that I came across, and again, you alluded to earlier, and it comes up in terms of both like partners, but then children and so on as well, were testosterone and estrogen and their interactions with oxytocin. And kind of going back to the fish example to some extent, but what there seems to be is an opposite interaction between testosterone and oxytocin. So where, broadly speaking, testosterone has that effect on males, like being more aggressive and so on, oxytocin then sort of, if you will, tampers that down a little bit, right?
Yeah.
And so you think about, what the purpose of these hormones are. Again, oversimplifying, but, testosterone in terms of a male protecting himself, and so on, trying to maybe, look good for a potential mate and so on. But then now you have a mate that you're bonding with. Okay, that aggressive is not going to be very good anymore. And so oxytocin increases, testosterone tends to decrease. And same thing with kids, not that there's not, protection of your children and those kind of things. But again, you don't want to be aggressive towards children and so on. So that opposite interaction tends to be the case. Whereas for females, estrogen and oxytocin tend to go hand in hand. And I think the most interesting thing for me from the science standpoint is I tend to think about, there's this hormone and it does that. And, sometimes we focus on the memory of it and this hormone does that. But it was very interesting to see that it was saying, with the release of estrogen, what's one of the things that does? Is it going to cells and causing those cells to produce more receptors to oxytocin? So then those cells are more responsive to the oxytocin that's being released. And yeah, it was just something that really stuck out to me in terms of like, oh yeah, these things don't just stand alone as we've talked about with the other ones, but on the level of, it's actually causing changes in our body, the one hormone, estrogen in this case, but so that we respond better, if you will, to the oxytocin. Very cool. So it's, very fascinating in terms of, all that's going on with all those hormones in there and the various effects, oxytocin being the fascinating one that we're talking about here.
So after this break, we'll talk about touch and self-pleasure back here on riotradio.ca. Welcome back to the WellPod at DC, live from the Media Hub here on riotradio.ca. So interpersonal touch is a fundamental component of social interactions because it can mitigate physical and psychological distress, referred to as the Midas touch effect. Previous studies have demonstrated that interpersonal touch may affect our altruistic behavior. A classical study show that customers tend to give bigger tips when they're lightly touched on the arm by a waitress. Other studies have found that touching of the hand increases people to be a little bit more pro-social and agree a little bit more willing. So next time you have something you want someone to comply to, see what maybe a little consensual touch on the hand may persuade. Craig, we've had a previous episode on touch, and you talked about C fibers. So what's going on here with touch and oxytocin?
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, we've obviously in the first segment spoke about the hormone itself, but then what's the major player in terms of the release of it? And we touched, pardon the pun, but we touched upon it in the sense of, hugging a child, or you talked about like mother-child, like just after birth, like the connection of here's the baby and touch right away.
Petting of a dog
in those examples for sure. And so overall, when we're talking about touch, we're dealing, of course, with our nervous system and sending signals regarding feelings of our skin and so on to our brain. And there's a number of fibers that you come across, and I don't want to go off on too much of a tangent. Some fairly lazy scientists called them ABC because they didn't want to get too much more complex, I guess. But they have a variety of then sort of subcategories to that. And there's sometimes overlap with what they do. So, for example, like there's for the A fibers, there's alpha, beta, and delta A fibers, and the beta fibers are involved in light touch to some extent as well. And then some are involved in more signals of pain, like a sharp, acute sort of injury and so on. But it's really the C fibers involved in touch and what we're talking about here today, and a subcategory that are the tactile C fibers. Tactile just being the term for touch, right? And so these respond to more like sensual touches, which tend to be, as opposed to the acute situation or just a quick touch, right? Or a quick pressure or whatever the case is more involved, like longer touch, right? As something when we think about like sensual or even just holding hands with someone you love or hugging a child, right? These are longer term pressures on our skin and so on. And so then it's these tactile fibers that ultimately send signals up to our brain. And so they send signals up to our various parts of our brain, some of which we've chatted about before, because of course everything interacts up there about memory and who we want to have touch, right? Like if you think about a kid who's like, I just want mom or I just want dad sort of thing, like someone else that would not be a welcome touch. But all that to say, it sends signals to these portions of our brain that ultimately lead to the release of oxytocin. And then of course, the various effects that we were chatting about in the earlier section there, right? And so, it leads to all those positive connections for the most part, but stimulated by that sort of not necessarily hard, but like deep pressure. Pressure and so on. That comes with, someone sort of pushing on your arm or rubbing your arm, for example, or hand holding and those kinds of things. Yeah. And so in terms of that, then I'm curious what maybe you've come across in terms of, the touching, and we could talk about the fibers, but what kind of biohacks, as we've spoken to previously, are there for how do I maybe release some oxytocin, for myself or others or whatnot?
So touch is going to be one of the biggest, and I know that you came across that in your kind of research as well, is that we know activating that oxytocin is best going to come from that touch. So our student question of the week highlighted an interesting area of touch that we don't often talk about. Not everyone is in a relationship, and this doesn't have an impact on necessarily the release of oxytocin. So we might not always have someone kind of hugging us or touching us in that way, but it is true that self-pleasure, self-touch can actually be good for our well-being. So let's talk a little bit about masturbation. So long before Jason and his pie or Timothy and his peach, evolutionary biologists have traced the origins of masturbation to primates 40 million years ago. We also see it depicted in prehistoric cave paintings, and it's found in deep mythology and traditions culturally around the world. Egyptian, for instance, mythology, the god Atum created the universe. He created the universe by masturbating, and that's how the universe came to be in Egyptian culture. So masturbation is self-stimulation of your genitals and other sensitive areas of your body for sexual arousal or for pleasure. Illegal when done in public, but in your personal private spaces, yes, it can hold many physical and psychological benefits. The social views around masturbation have varied greatly in different cultures and over history. In 1745, the British physician Robert James, he's not in my good books, he published something called the Medical Dictionary, in which he described masturbation as being the most deplorable, generally incurable disorders. And this really kind of started a whole wave where individuals saw this as something very negative. In the late 1800s, Dr. John Harvey Kellogg, whose name you might recognize from the inventor of cornflakes, was a very zealous campaigner against masturbation, claiming neither plague nor war nor smallpox or any similar diseases have produced results so disastrous to humanity. So he recommended to cure children to tie their hands behind their backs, covering their genitals with patented cages. So they actually invented kind of chastity belts, sewing the foreskin shut, electrical shock, and circumcision without anesthesia to break those habits. And yes, those tasty cornflakes were developed as a ready-to-eat, healthy anti-masturbation meal. I don't know if you know that about cornflakes.
I did not know that at all.
You might not look at a box of Kellogg's cornflakes in the same way.
No.
Masturbation was even considered a mental illness in the DSM, that big diagnostic statistical manual, until 1968. So Lauren Wazwa's 2014 Masturbation and Pop Culture book explored over 600 scenes from film and television where masturbation is commonly seen as either evil, like Mr. Kellogg, or really comical. And rarely do we see accurate, realistic experiences of self-pleasure. This really perpetuates a misunderstanding, an embarrassment, and there's different perspectives and assumptions and feelings and values around masturbation. Whether or not you engage in self-pleasure, your body, your choice. If we choose to not masturbate because of our values, for instance, then we've made a conscious decision based on something that is very important to us. But if we choose not to masturbate because of shame, this is something worth exploring, perhaps with a support. Sexologist Dr. Jessie O'Reilly, host of a really great podcast at Sex with Dr. Jess, states we tend to stifle expressions of all pleasure. When we eat, we're told to do so silently. We're told to close our mouths and disallow the ums and the ahs. So food can be a really great place to start to begin to open up verbally with these expressions of pleasure. So we're trying to break down these walls around pleasure to normalize and open up these conversations. Since many of us don't talk about it, we might learn from really unreliable, more entertainment-based resources. So I really encourage you to check out more reliable sources. Local sex stores can sometimes be surprisingly a really great place to find some resources. Or one of my favorite online resources, healthline.com, has some really good how-to start engaging or continue to engaging in self-pleasure. Tanga's 2018 Global Self-Pleasure Report surveyed 13,000 individuals from 18 to 74 across 18 countries. And what they discovered, 92% of men and 76% of women reported that they masturbate. So it is common, and perhaps some of those numbers are even lower due to some of that shame and embarrassment and not feeling comfortable talking about it. So studies have shown that masturbation can reduce stress, tension, and pain, physical pain, improve sleep, focus, which is really good as a student, and really help boost our mood. It can help prevent anxiety and depression, and in men, it actually lowers the risk of prostate cancer. There are many myths about masturbation, and research hasn't proved a single one of them. It does not cause vision loss. It does not cause your hair to grow on your palms. It does not cause shrinkage or decreased sperm count over the long term. Scientifically, there's nothing immoral or wrong about masturbation. However, if masturbation is interfering with your daily life or relationships or causing kind of invasive and intense negative feelings, such as guilt or shame or embarrassment, as mentioned, this is really important to reach out and gain some support to help normalize and reduce some of those feelings. So working together perhaps to find some alternative tools or some alternative mindsets. So we release oxytocin when we touch ourselves, even in non-sexual ways. So self-touching, what's really interesting is it increases during times of stress. So if you perhaps look at some of your friends around the exam time season or really stressful moments, you might notice they touch their necks, they rub their arms. We sometimes touch our mouths and our chin a little bit more. And this is all done unconsciously, perhaps, to help self-soothe. And so we are kind of naturally trying to activate those seed fibers and start to get some of the calming, relaxing effects from oxytocin, making us feel safe as well. So let's do a quick activity in a non-sexual way to activate these C fibers and doing a very quick self-massage. This is something you can do on the bus. This is something you can do sitting at a desk. And so we're going to start by warming up our hands. So you can rub your hands together and get them nice and warm. And we're going to take our left hand and place it on the right side of your neck. And you're just going to squeeze the muscles in between themselves, not to a place of being uncomfortable, but just a nice deep pressure like you were talking about, Craig. Then what you can do is you can work towards down by your shoulder. You can start to squeeze those arm muscles, getting closer to your elbow, all the way down your arm. You can go to the other side, taking your right hand, putting it on the left side of your neck, really starting at that base between your shoulder and your neck, squeezing those muscles together. Again, coming out to the shoulder, squeezing those muscles together, down to your elbow and down to your hand. A really fun thing to do as well is to take your hands and kind of rub your earlobes together. So almost like you're making hands like they're little beaks and rubbing your earlobes and really going up on your ears. These are areas that aren't often touched. And so it can actually feel quite pleasurable and quite good to give your ears a little bit of a rub. Last but not least, if you want to look at your hands, you can kind of use your thumb and pushing it into your palm and pushing that kind of thumb muscle around, and kind of similar, taking your hand almost like a bird beak and kind of squeezing your fingers. So really rubbing your fingers all together. This helps activate that idea of self-touch in a non-sexual way, so a way that can be done publicly, but can be really, really helpful for us. Somatic therapy is a very body-centered approach to therapy, and it's something that tries to kind of activate our body and our emotions together to reduce stress and tension and in a lot of our trauma responses. And so somatic therapist Dr. Peter Levine recommends starting with something called the butterfly hug. So really simply, you can take your right hand and put it under your left armpit, and your left hand and put it over your right shoulder, and you're kind of giving yourself a hug. Again, applying that deep pressure, not too deep, not to a place of pain or discomfort, but just really giving yourself a good squeeze every once in a while when you're feeling really stressed out. It may seem so simplistic and so small, but 10, 20 seconds of that's really interesting what can open up. So after this break, we'll continue to explore oxytocin as a wingmate and talk a little bit more about some biohacks to get that oxytocin flowing back here on riotradio.ca. Welcome back to the WellPod at DC, live from the Media Hub here on riotradio.ca. So keeping in mind what we mentioned earlier about oxytocin being this kind of positive feedback loop, how can we get the ball rolling a little bit to help really boost and get the oxytocin flowing? So before the break, we were talking about the power of touch. In research, we see this can be one of the best ways to really activate the oxytocin to start flowing, but we can do some other things as well to keep it going, to really reap those benefits that we've been talking about today for our psychological and overall well-being. So exercise is one thing that research is really looking at. They don't quite understand what's happening here, but what they are noticing is when we exercise, especially in yoga, there is an increase in oxytocin often that's being produced. Part of my brain was like, well, if we're moving our body, we might be like, on the ground, touching the ground, or maybe using some equipment. So maybe it's activating some of those C fibers that we've been talking about. Yeah. But something is happening during exercise that is really helping the oxytocin flow. Another one, which if you live with some neurodivergence might already be making you feel a little bit uncomfortable, is the concept of eye contact and gazing into somebody's eyes. What's really interesting is research found that it didn't matter if it was human, but even like looking at your dog and looking in your dog's eyes was producing kind of a similar effect. And so looking in people's eyes, and if you have a close friend or a family member that you feel comfortable doing this with, setting a timer for even just 1 minute. And you can laugh, you can giggle, you can blink. It's not a staring contest. But looking in somebody's eyes and gazing, it's interesting to see what happens.
I even find sometimes like interacting with somebody, like, someone's come into my office to say something, okay, I'm listening and maybe preparing something or whatnot. But yeah, then like trying to be better about, feeling welcoming more and so on. But like then looking at their eyes, sometimes there's that little bit of, if you will, more connected in a, okay, I don't know what the feeling is. I can't even describe it, but
and it's a very often Western perspective around eye contact. We hear it often talked about for building trust and building bonding. Like you're supposed to look at people's eyes, and it's like, ooh, well, if it's producing a lot of oxytocin, and oxytocin is helping us feel more trusting, a little bit more bonded, a little bit more connected. Perhaps this is kind of why this is all linked together here. One of my favorites as well is music. And so what a lot of studies found is listening to music, but especially creating your own music. And so if you're feeling really stressed out, humming a little jingle, singing a little bit of song, even if it doesn't make much sense, it's interesting. Research is showing that also can help kind of start pumping some of the oxytocin. Focusing on somebody that you care about. So in meditation, if you hold already a meditation practice, instead of doing like a mantra meditation or a deep breathing meditation, focusing your meditation on reflecting on that person, reflecting on your memories with that person, or, as we've been talking a lot about today, just quality time with people, hanging out with your friends. One thing I say to students often as a wellness coach is there's more to support your learning than just kind of the academic study, read the textbook. We need fun and leisure. We need time with people. And it doesn't need to be the best friend. It doesn't need to be, a really deep loved one. But spending time in a community and spending time with people, interesting the oxytocin effect that can start to boost.
Yeah, and when you were saying about the yoga, and I get the touch and so on, but like most, at least when I picture it, I picture a yoga class.
Yes.
And it's here you are, even not necessarily that connected, except for we all signed up for the 8 a.m. yoga class on Mondays. But there's 10 of us here together, and my brain goes to, maybe something that's not connected at all, but like the mirror neurons that we've talked about before is here we are all trying to do or doing the exact same pose, all thinking together about being relaxed and so on. And I can only imagine that, some of that then ties into and oxytocin, be free.
Yeah, absolutely. So in relationships, oxytocin is your ultimate wingmate. Share food with somebody, stare into their eyes, listen to some music, move your bodies together, maybe in a sensual way, or maybe just in a way that's more exercise-based. Engage in consensual touch, either self-touch, both together at the same time, or touching each other in a non-sexual way. This is going to, again, create that really positive feedback and really enhance the overall oxytocin oxytocin. Do you need to be in a relationship for these benefits? Absolutely not. You can do this for yourself. Share some food with somebody, whether it's the dining hall here in residence or out in the community. Listen to some music. Look at your own eyes in a mirror. There's lots of ways we can kind of try to turn that oxytocin around and get it feeling more relaxed and more comfortable and more safe. But Craig, I'm curious, fellow students that may be listening, can we boost our learning with an increase in oxytocin? Like, what's the relationship here with this bonding hormone and our studies?
Yeah, for sure. And even just to speak broadly, and just because I like making connections, right? But you think about, okay, how much more, going back to the yoga example we were saying, as much as I haven't researched it, and maybe it's not about the group together, but, you know, thinking about here we are as a group, sort of, you know, to some extent doing our own thing, but together, you know, thinking about like study groups. How does this maybe overlap with things and so on? And so I'll come back to that in terms of a couple of, you know, how it might interplay with studying. We talked about the memory earlier and having a potential impact with that back and forth, if you will, or control with cortisol, and then oxytocin being shown to help us make memories. But an interesting article that I came across that was speaking about oxytocin, but talking as well about some diseases and so on, but outcomes from those diseases were one of the areas it was referring to research regarding dementia and outcomes for patients who are dealing with Alzheimer's or other forms of dementia, where when they tend to be alone, the progress of that tends to be worse than when they're still in social interactions with people, right? Not that it, of course, takes away the for lack of a better way of saying it, the negatives of the disease, but it slows it down to some extent. So yet another, like, well, what is oxytocin doing in that case with, even though it's not creating the dementia itself, how is it interacting with whatever hormones or chemicals that are going on and causing that slowdown, which was very interesting. And so, you know, a few, just to summarize anyways, a few things I came across, you know, how to boost learning, sort of using oxytocin, if you will. I'll start with the, you know, social learning, right? Being around others and, you know, interacting, forming a study group together with people that you trust and enjoy being around and whatnot, so that, you know, beyond the, if you will, maybe mind science of learning in terms of the, you know, just interaction of how we're going through the material. But then also, I'm boosting oxytocin in there. So I'm using various strategies, but I'm also using this hormone to help me make connections in the end, right?
A student the other day was speaking about coming to your beautiful space over in the SSB, the SALS area. And they were saying, you know, even though we weren't like a unified study group, being in that space with individuals that are kind of having the shared interest of studying, they noticed it made a big change in kind of the memory, the retention that they had. But also, I'm wondering about the oxytocin here. They felt more comfortable. They felt safer. They felt more relaxed when they were in that space compared to some others on campus. So it was like, ooh, something might be happening here when we get together.
No, that's very interesting. And not to go too much of a tangent, but even thinking about, you know, studying on campus for the reasons that you mentioned, maybe different areas on campus, but even sometimes, like, you know, home versus campus. I always kind of think about like doing work at home versus you know, actually at work. Like, is that part of it too? Because here I am at Durham College with other people who are trying to learn overall and so on. So as much as you're saying individual places within campus, but I'm here to learn. Hey, so are these other people here, and what effect that might have in the end is very fascinating to think about. As we've talked about, it seems to have some interaction, you know, with our memory and forming more memories. So then if it's a matter of, having good social interactions as a study group, even to some extent thinking about, you know, stepping away from studying. I often emphasize to students, like, you do some of your best studying when, you know, you're asleep, which is a whole other episode, right? But is, you know, when you've had breaks from things and said, okay, it's, you know, the weekend or it's whatever amount of time, and I'm hanging out with family, I'm hanging out with friends, whatever makes you, comfortable and so on in amongst those groups.
Yeah.
But this is going to be, okay, well, my brain in the background is still processing what I've learned through the week and is releasing oxytocin that helps me form those memories, not just that interaction and trust right then and there, but in terms of remembering content from class and so on. And then it also seems to have an involvement in rewarding, and I think to some extent that's like, again, the dopamine, the reward of like, oh yeah, okay, I feel good because I, spend some time studying and, maybe with a group or maybe at least among people also studying.
Yeah.
I'm more likely to actually remember that material as that bit of a reward, the like, oh, I feel like I've accomplished something, or I feel good, and so on.
Yeah.
And then the last one I came across was I think something we all experience is the being negative on yourself when you're trying to learn something and, why can't I just get it? Or whatever we might say to ourselves. But maybe kind of going back to your student example is, I was in this place, I felt safe, I felt among other people, that were doing things. I had some release of oxytocin. What I wasn't saying to myself is, I'll use myself as Craig, you've gone through this 4 times now and you still don't remember it. Like, you obviously can't do this, right? But hey, I feel good about it in the end. And so then that takes away that added stress that, unfortunately, the cortisol leads us to not actually remembering stuff where the oxytocin is involved in memory.
Ooh.
Yeah, so very interesting. Yeah.
Well, this is the end of our show today. Resources mentioned in today's episode, don't forget, is on our Instagram at wellness@DC. You can email questions to be discussed anonymously on air. WellPod at durhamcollege.ca. Next week, we're joined by various female leaders across Durham College to honor International Women's Day as we dive into the next hormone, estrogen. So you can follow the Media Hub on social media at DCSA Media Hub. Thanks for exploring what it means to be well with us today, and we'll see you next time on riotradio.ca.